Okay, well, tonight's speaker, as you can see, is Michael Jackson. He's a Victoria resident since 1986. He taught science at the St. Michael's University School, and he's now retired. He's a naturalist and expedition leader for several companies, has been to the Arctic and Galapagos Islands and the Antarctic, and he's produced the handbook to the Galapagos. Now I have a copy of it here, which looks like that. Which is one that I've used. My wife and I have been to the Galapagos, and it was very useful for that. And for the last 6 years, he's been leading trips with Maple Leaf Adventures to Haida Gwaii, Southeast Alaska, and the Great Bear Rainforest. And that's what he's going to be talking about tonight. So I'll now turn it over to Michael Jackson.
All right. Well, thanks, Phil. I'm hoping is the audio good for everybody as far as I can tell? Yep. Okay. So, I'm actually really happy that on this talk, there's a few of my Maple Leaf colleagues. I know at least 2 people on the talk were also on the expedition, so I better be careful what I say. But first of all, I want to mention that a lot of the photos are mine. But I've got a lot of great photos from Jeff Reynolds, who's on tonight, Simon Ager, Sarah Hauser, Jackie Wind, and others. So just to give you a sense of what I'm going to try and do is introduce the Great Bear Rainforest, a little bit about what that is and what's special about it, and then take you into this project that we call the MDRI, which Marine Debris Removal Initiative. And then spend some time just talking about the stuff we found. And if you have questions, please feel free to throw those into the chat. And I think Phil can interrupt me, or if you have a really pressing question, feel free to blurt it out. So, where is the Great Bear Rainforest? I say it's that central coast area from basically Vancouver Island up to the Alaska border on the mainland side. So that is all considered to be the Great Bear Rainforest. And the Great Bear Rainforest, I think, can also be known as the Great Salmon Forest, because it's really the salmon that seem to link the ocean and the forest together. So much so that the trees in the forest here actually contain nitrogen from the salmon brought there through the bears and so on. So here you can see some salmon in one of the creeks on the coast coming into spawn. And whoops, okay, let's go to the next one. Yeah. And we've got 5 species of salmon on our coast, and pink, sockeye, chum, coho, chinook, they all come into different rivers and different numbers, and they really form the lifeblood of the Great Bear Rainforest. And their spawning procedure basically generates a huge amount of food for the animals that live in the Great Bear Rainforest. And here you can see some salmon spawning, and at the end of their life, the carcasses basically fertilize the environment. But what's really important is that they are feeding virtually everything else in the forest. Here you can see a group of gulls here that are being, are these Franklins or Bonapartes? Yeah. Anyway, and we've got Steller's jay eating a bunch of salmon eggs directly in the stream. Here we've got a little pine marten who's trying to help himself to a bit of salmon carcass. And of course, one of the iconic species, the grizzly bear. And you can see three grizzlies and one of my favorite ships in the background there. And say the grizzly bear is really sort of the apex predator on land, and the one of the most amazing things to see when you're in the Great Bear Rainforest. We also have lots and lots of black bears, and they're also helping themselves to the salmon. And many of you have heard of the spirit bear, which also is found on several islands in the central Great Bear Rainforest. And the spirit bear, by the way, is just a white phase of the black bear. But also on land, we have the Great Bear Rainforest on land, but on the ocean, the kelp forests are also really a major part of this whole environment. A very rich environment, lots of ochre stars that are very rich intertidal zones, lots of places with sea otters, humpback whales, and for much of the summer and the fall, we see a lot of humpback whales. And one of the things that I think is particularly cool about humpback whales is that they have this unique underside to their tail. And that pattern that you see on the tail is essentially a fingerprint ID for individual whales. And if you can send photos like this into a site called Happy Whale, they will identify very often your whale and also tell you where it's been. And some of the whales I photographed on this trip, I found had been coming back and forth to this coast since the early 2000s, and they spend the winter in Hawaii and so on and so forth. And here you can see a sampling of the different humpback tails that we see on the BC coast. Another whale that we see is the fin whale. And the fin whale is the second largest whale in the world and also the world's fastest whale. And we see fin whales sporadically up in the central Great Bear Rainforest coast. There's another shot of a fin whale. Another iconic species for our coast is the orca or the killer whale. And we've got both northern residents and also transients. This is a pod of northern residents that we saw in around King Island. But we also get Pacific white-sided dolphins and doll porpoises and sea lions. These are stellar sea lions on an island in the central Great Bear Rainforest. And one of the ships that I work on in the background there, the Cascadia. And another iconic top predator on the coast would be the coastal wolf. And this one here is on Campania Island in the center of the Great Bear Rainforest. Trotting along, and you can see here the wolf is swimming across the inlet. They are very comfortable to be swimming across channels. And not to forget that a big part of the Great Bear Rainforest are the First Peoples, the First Nations who live there. This is the very new big house in Bella Bella that was opened just over a year ago. And you can see the inside of the house here right after, actually this is the morning after a big potlatch, so they've done a lot of cleaning. So that's sort of hopefully an introduction to what's special about the Great Bear Rainforest. And now I want to take you on what we actually did. So first of all, the whole thing was conceived by Kevin Smith, who was owner of Maple Leaf Adventures. And he collaborated with 4 other tourism companies, which are called the Small Ship Tour Operators Association. And he also collaborated and obtained permission from the coastal First Nations. And this project lasted over almost 7 weeks and employed well over 100 out of work crew, because basically our tourist season had been completely kiboshed. And there were about 70 First Nations people who were also employed in various parts of the project. And our original plan was to remove about 20 or 30 tons of debris from the outer coast. And more on that later. The cost, this was funded by the government, kind of mostly provincial with some federal help. And that was, total cost was $3.5 million. And this was kind of partly a cleanup program, but also a tourism industry support program. And this is the Clean Waters Initiatives Fund. Fund is the name of the program. These were the First Nations that we worked with, particularly the Wikinyu, the Heiltsuk, the Kitasukhehe, and the Gitgat were all the major the nations that we worked with. And these are some of the ships that we worked with. This is the Columbia 3 from Mothership Adventures, a beautiful 1956 boat that mostly specializes in kayaking trips. Blue Water Adventures has the Passing Cloud, another beautiful sailboat. Great Bear 2 was the smallest of the fleet, with I think a passenger capacity of about 5. And Blue Water Adventures is another tour company that was involved, and they have 3 sailboats, the Solitude, the Odyssey, and the Roamer. And then Maple Leaf Adventures has 3 ships, the Maple Leaf, which is a classic 1904 ship that has been cared for and is still in wonderful shape and working hard on the coast. Another of our ships, the Swell, was built in 1912 as a tugboat and is still plying the coasts. It's had a few modifications over the years, but it's still fundamentally that 1912 ship. And the newest ship in the Maple Leaf fleet is this one, the Cascadia, which I was working on this summer and also last summer. And Cascadia has a capacity of 24 guests. So this is, again, another review of where the Great Bear Rainforest is. Some people include Haida Gwaii in the Great Bear Rainforest, other people don't, but it's all kind of very much the same kind of terrain. And that yellow circle basically shows you where we were operating on this expedition. And I think an important part of this expedition is, and why the group that we were well suited to this, is that there are no roads to that area. The only way you can get to those islands and to those coastlines is with ships. And so we were able to access those areas. And you can see down below here, Vancouver Island, and then we've got Calvert Island, and then Aristizabal, Price, and so on. These are the islands along the Great Bear Rainforest coast. And we organized ourselves into 2 expeditions. The first expedition basically spent its time in this area that you can see here, Calvert, Hunter, and then Campbell Island, as well as the Goose Group. And then the second expedition went up further north and was planning to go and do Price Island and all of Aristizabal Island and then Campania, but we found so much stuff that we couldn't make it up there. Back in 2015, there was an overflight made that ran down the coast and spotted sites like this. And you can see those white objects on the beach. And those white objects are huge pieces of foam. And actually, unfortunately, those pieces of foam are still there. We saw them, but we couldn't actually land at that site on this trip. So here is a group of captains meeting to discuss the plans. We had 9 ships in the fleet, and so there was a lot of coordination and figuring out. You can see we're all kind of social distancing here. And then here is Kevin Smith and myself. We were at this point working on the helicopter operations, which is more of that later. But here we are in the bridge of Cascadia. Another key part of our expedition was the helicopter operation. This is our helicopter pilot, Jason, and he had an assistant who, Nolan, was also very, very important in the program. And one of my jobs, one of my big roles on the trip was managing all the data for all the bags. We collected debris, we put them into bags, and then we had to figure out, or we had to record where they were so that we could come back and find them a week or so later. And I also was involved in sharing that data with other ships, and I would do little kayak expeditions to airdrop the information to the other people. So this map here shows you the green dots show the first expedition sites, and the purple dots show the second expedition sites. In total, we had about 400 sites over the two expeditions spread out along that coast. And this is a zoomable Google map that, if we have time, maybe at the end I can show you more of. So I wanted to kind of basically show you the process. And the first phase of the process was gathering the debris. We would go on the beaches, pick up the debris, and put them into these lift bags. And the lift bags had to be under 300 kilograms to be liftable by the helicopter. And the bags had a capacity of about 1 1/3 cubic meters. And we had to make sure that we left the lift bags, excuse me, well above the high tide line for later pickup. Then the phase 2, which was kind of the last week, the shore crews would relocate and basically staff the lift bags. And then the helicopter would move from site to site and lift the bags from the shore to the barge. And then ultimately the barge transfers everything to Port Hardy. And here you can see a shot of people working on the beach. This is a fairly typical bit of coastline, basically lots of logs, not easy walking, and just huge amounts of debris on the shore. We had to spend quite a bit of time in some places kind of sawing things up and cutting things up to try and make them fit into the bags. And here I'm hacksawing a piece of piping. Here somebody's digging out some net from the mud. And you can see just this mess of rope. And sometimes this rope was tied into the logs and had to be cut out and levered out. And so sometimes removing a pile of rope like this could take quite a while. We would, pretty much all the time, we would try and weigh the materials that we found and then put them into larger bags. And here's Sarah recording bag composition, bag weight, and bag location so that we can come back a week later and pick it all up. And we would leave our bags above the high tide line like this, and hopefully they're there when we come back. And you can see a group. This was one of the things that I should mention is that our expedition happened during obviously during COVID time, and so the first 10 days or so of the trip, we basically had to maintain a lot of protocols and procedures to try and keep ourselves safe. We were actually all tested before we went on the expedition, and but after 2 weeks, we were able to socialize a bit more, which was kind of nice for a while. Another shot of a shoreline full of bags. And sometimes we couldn't leave, or we didn't think that a bag was going to be suitable on a shoreline. We couldn't find a good place for it. And so we would gather all the debris on the shore and then shift it back into our tender. You can see back here. And sometimes that was a bit of an adventure. And here you can see a tender full of debris. Sorry, was that a question or?
Stuff.
Oh, sorry. Sometimes we'd find things like this fish tote and have to tow it out to get it back to the ships. But then a key part of our operation was the tug and barge and helicopter, and they basically were able to gather all of the stuff that we collected. So once that started, the helicopter crew, you can see here, came on board and basically gave a presentation to the crew about how to hook up the bags, because we had to be trained on how to lift these bags. And here you can see me ready for the first lift. And here you can see another couple of crew basically ready to receive the helicopter and hook up the bags to the helicopter. When this process was happening, there was quite a lot of sitting and waiting for the crews, because we had to make sure that there was crew at every site ready for the helicopter, because helicopter time was very expensive, and we needed to make sure that each site was ready for the helicopter to kind of go one after another. So I think this next little video I've got here, I hope this will show. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the actual operation. And here we are lifting the very, very first bags from the Hackeye Institute. And there we go. You can see there's actually 3 bags tied up to the helicopter lift at one time there. And then they were carried over to the barge that had all these containers on it, and the helicopter pilot would very expertly drop them into the containers. Here's a bit later in the expedition, and you can see that the barge is starting to fill up. And you can just see the stuff that we were transporting, from barrels to fishing floats, and sometimes the bag was hidden by all of the hitchhikers, as we call them. And here's Nolan and Robert, who are working on the barge. Another shot of a lift load being deposited. And there you can kind of see the whole system, the barge, the tug, and the helicopter all in one shot. So we faced a few challenges, and one of those challenges was fog. Fog actually prevented the helicopter coming up on time for both expeditions. And then in both expeditions, we found that a lot of mornings we had fog, because it was getting to be mid to late September, and we couldn't operate in the fog. So here we can see the fog rolling into the Goose Group. There you can again see the fog coming in. And so there were times when we had morning fog and couldn't start working until noon, and there were other times when we had afternoon fog that stopped us at early afternoon. And then one time we actually had to do night ops. We ran out of daylight, and we ran out of time in one spot. And so what we ended up having to do was to gather about 25 bags from the shores, throw them into the dinghies, and then at night we brought them back to Cascadia, where we have a winch, and we winched them onto the ship here. And you can see this is all happening at about 9 o'clock at night. And this was the morning after. You can see a collection of bags that we had put on the deck, and a large aquaculture fish farm float that had broken open. So that kind of gives you an idea of how the process goes. The gathering on the beach, the putting it all into a site, and then lifting it to the barge. And so here a little bit about what we found. And we found a lot of fishing gear, nets, buoys, crab floats, a lot of rope, from small stuff to huge, 3-4 inch hawsers, lots of plastic bottles, styrofoam, and some other stuff. And now I'm going to do a little experiment here, because I'm hoping that I can, let's see if I can do this. Okay. I think I'm going to try and launch a poll here. So there's a question on the screen, I hope, that asks you, how much did we find? We were planning to collect 20 to 30 tons. And hopefully you guys can click on one of those choices. Is that coming through, Phil?
I can see it, yeah.
Oh, I see answers going in.
So we have 83 participants, so.
Yep. I'm going to give people a couple of minutes, or maybe a minute. We've got lots of answers coming in here. And then the second question is, what was our, biggest quantity haul, so to speak? And you can see, was it foam? Was it rope? Was it bottles, floats, butts, fishing nets? Okay, we've got 75% have voted. I think I'll wait till we've got 85%, which is coming up very soon. Oh, we're already up to 90%, almost. Okay, so I'm going to end the polling now. And I think when I do this, you'll see the results, I hope. I've never tried this before, so. Do you guys see the results there?
There should be a button at the bottom that says share results.
There we go. Thank you. You got it. So can you see the results now?
We can see the percentages.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, the correct number was actually guessed by 46. We got about 127 tons of debris over the 2 expeditions, when we were planning to get 20 to 30 tons. And you'll see a little bit later that probably the items that were, it kind of depends on whether you do it by weight or by volume. By volume, styrofoam might have been the biggest, but fishing floats were almost certainly the largest by mass. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. So let's see, I'm going to see what happens now if I hit stop sharing results and close that. And let's see. Okay, so we found 127 tons of debris. We gathered debris at over 400 sites. And I actually just received the final report, a copy of the final report today. And we calculated that we had about 1,000 cubic meters of debris that were collected. So a huge, huge quantity. And the next few slides actually came out of that report this afternoon, so I haven't really had a chance to really look at them. But this is looking at several different ways of analyzing the debris. But here you can see that a huge proportion of the debris came from fishing and aquaculture, and a bit less from rope, foam, and single-use plastics, but they were all pretty relevant there. And then this other graph here, using a different technique, showed, or actually this was Expedition 2, again, fishing and aquaculture versus the others. So you can see that the vast majority of what we found came from the fishing industry. However, most of that was international fishing, not British Columbia. Some of the other, we had another set of data that looked at some of the bags in more detail, and you can see again a kind of a breakdown of what we found. But fully a quarter was fishing floats. So these were floats that had at one point been attached to nets and had departed. And I think this was, yeah, so another graph showing you the proportions. So this was one of the sites where we landed on the Goose Group, and you can kind of see just in the top of the hill here, there's just a hint of a couple of bits of float. And once we got a little bit closer, that is what we saw. And we saw, here's a close-up of that same spot. You can just see the huge amount of debris that has been gathering there over the years. And this is what it looked like afterwards. And you can see here, that same site. I'm going to show you the before. So that's the before, and that was the after. So it gives you an idea of how effective it was to clean all that stuff out. But there's an awful lot of debris out there. Here you can see just in amongst the logs, we've got plastic bottles, pieces of foam, bits of fishing float, and another beach with barrels and containers and hard plastic, tires, forklift flats, aquaculture floats, these fish totes, netting, and more netting, and even more netting. And this is a pretty typical beach as we encountered it on the shoreline, and you can just see huge quantities of stuff just tossed up in amongst the logs. And there you can see inside inside one of the lift bags. So these white bags were the lift bags where we gathered things into, and you can just see the contents of what was in there. Just a mixture of bottles, foam, floats, and miscellaneous bits and pieces. Solar panels. Not quite sure what that was, but. And again, here's just a few more shots of just the nature of the debris that we found. We would often gather the debris in burlap sacks or garbage bags and then bring them to a central spot and then weigh the burlap sacks and then empty those into the white lift bags. So fishing gear, we found lots of fishing gear, and most of the fishing gear that we found came from Asia. And sometimes you'd have, you can see here, the volume of the fishing floats exceeded the volume of the bags. Again, more fishing floats. Oops, what happened there? Again, these are gill net floats. Sorry, that picture there is gill net floats. And these are another kind of gill net float from Japan. There were a lot of crab floats, and the American states all have very good identifying tags on their crab floats, so you can actually tell which boat was responsible and which year it came from. And we had some stuff that went back at least almost 10 years. I think we had some that went back into the early 2000s. I think, I don't remember if I got one here, 2008, 2009. So you can see lots of that. British Columbia floats, all they have to have is a number on them, and so you don't know exactly where they came from or which ship was responsible. But we had crab floats from California to Alaska. Fishing nets were, again, a big item that when we found one, they were often quite a big operation to clear out. And it was pretty satisfying once you've started to work on one of these things and then eventually get it out from amongst the logs, because these things are all made out of polypropylene that is continuously breaking down into smaller and smaller pieces. But you can also see how, in some cases, the nets have become really part of the, almost part of the forest. This was another find that we had where we found all these Scotchmen, and one of these is currently sitting in my boat right now. Came all the way home, but these were stuck in a little crevice on a remote island in the Central Coast. We found huge amounts of rope. And you can see here this bag is completely filled with rope. And this rope, one of the big problems with the rope is that a lot of it's this polypropylene stuff, and you can see it fraying there, and the little tiny fragments just fall off, especially with the ultraviolet, and basically put all this tiny microplastics into the ocean, which is a tremendous problem. And here you can see a rope that's in varying stages of breakdown. Just lots and lots and lots of rope. And on the right, on the left there, you can see this is the rope before we started to get it out of the logs. And a while later, we actually had successfully retrieved it from underneath the logs, and then were able to bag it. These were the kinds of ropes that we found. And you can see this rope has obviously been there for quite a long time and is just gradually decomposing and fraying. We also found lots of plastic bottles all over. These are a sample of some of these, and this one over here is actually from Romania, from China. We had some from Greece. We had Korea, Vietnam, Russia. We had basically a lot of different places. And again, that's how they looked, all the various plastic bottles looked at in amongst the logs. We've got a Vietnamese, and then a Russian bottle, and a Chinese bottle there. Greek bottle, Korean liquor bottle. And very often you can't really see anything on the actual bottles themselves, but the caps tell you a little bit about where they came from. We did find some Canadian stuff. This obviously is Canadian because it's in French and English, but there was a little irony there in the helping people in the planet. And you can also see that some of those bottles have been around for quite a while. The styrofoam, or more properly called EPS, or expanded polystyrene, was another huge item in what we found. And here you can see a bag full of foam, and mostly foam. And then here I've got a bin full of foam. There's Bryden, our captain, helping out with the lifting. And some of the pieces of foam were as big as a small iceberg, and we call them foam bergs. And we would drift those out and bring them back to the ship, and then winch them back onto the ship. And here we are ready to actually put them in a net to lift them to the barge. So I think this next Phil, did that first video work out okay?
Sorry. Yes,
Okay, I have a second video I want to try, so I'm gonna.
it stuttered a little bit on
Okay.
my screen.
So much of this debris that we've encountered comes from the international fishing industry. So this lift bag, or this lift net, which is going to be one of our last loads of the 6-week expedition, has a classic example of these styrofoam floats. We've seen these styrofoam cylinders all over the coast. We've probably picked up several hundred of these during the course of the expeditions. But this one over here is an example of how they look when they're kind of in action. They're covered with this super light duty green mesh and a bit of rope. And when those things fall apart, the whole thing starts to decompose. The rope breaks down, the mesh cover bag breaks down, and then eventually all the styrofoam itself breaks down. So we also found places, and it's a little bit hard to see here, but all of that white stuff that's in amongst the roots there is styrofoam, and we actually call this a styrofoam midden because it was like the clamshells, but it was styrofoam, and there was so much of it in and amongst the rocks, and there were places where there was just simply no way to get it all cleared up. And you can also see some of the styrofoam has been around for an awful long time. So much so that the forest is literally growing into it. And we found lots of other stuff, piping. There's a lot of freshwater piping that was, piping that was probably used for freshwater hoses for possibly for fish farms. There were a few floats for probably used for docks or again aquaculture. I'm not sure yet whether this was a septic tank or a water tank, but whichever one it was, we were able to retrieve it and bring it back on board. And there it is. It's a pretty good sized piece of debris. Everything from crates, not milk crates, but gooey duck crates, some from the States and some from Asia. And then there's a little bit of what I would call cool stuff that we found. And I'm going to show you a few of those. So one of the things that everybody kind of beachcombing on the coast is out looking for are these glass balls that were used quite a few years ago to support nets, and they're kind of a collector's item. And I think overall between the 9 ships, we probably found somewhere between 30 and 50 of these altogether. And some of them were really big and some of them were pretty small. And some of them were weird shape. This one here is called a rolling pin style. Again, you can just see a collection of these glass boats. Some of them have been polished, and but we also found this one. This Eddie Savage here has found one of these deep ocean, what they call glass spheres, and we weren't really sure what that was until I did a bit of research and found out that these things get put in a little plastic container, and then they are used to keep instruments off the bottom of the ocean. So they're designed to sink to, you can see this one says it'll go down to 6,700 meters. So they're designed to sink to the bottom or to be at the bottom of the ocean and withstand those incredible pressures and keep instruments floating off the bottom of the ocean. And we also found a few of these drifting buoys that were put out by the Ocean Sciences this up in Pat Bay. And here you can see what that looked like before. This is what we found, and this is what was actually deposited. There would be a little spot receiver on here, a doorstop, and then some foam, and then that would be transmitting position. You can see a couple more shots here. And that was actually the track of that particular one that we found. It was deposited here and was found up north over there. Oh, sorry, it was actually deposited up here and came down south. And another one that we found, this one is a slightly more high-tech one called an Oscar. And that one was found where it had started near the Brooks Peninsula, northern Vancouver Island. And it was tracked for that period of time. And then we found it up here in the north central coast. And that's kind of what they looked like when they were operational before they ended up on the beaches. And we found these weird things. We had no idea what they were. They were kind of like giant plastic kelp, bull kelp, but we nicknamed them Sputniks. And took me a little while to figure out what they were. And eventually I found something on the web that looked like this. And then I found a bit more. And it turns out that these things are called surface velocity drifters. And the idea is that you have the float and this big 15-meter, 50-foot long Holy sock, as it's called, that basically makes the drifter go with the current and transmits its position to satellites, and then that information gets integrated into current models. And that gives you an idea of how many of these things are out there in the world oceans. And that's what allows us to understand the motion of the world's oceans. And so most of those devices get retrieved, but some of them don't. We also found some weird cables. We never actually figured out what this was actually for, but it was clearly some kind of a sciencey cable. There were a few things that we left behind. They were either too dangerous, like this barrel full of poison. We decided not to try and move that around. Sometimes things were so deeply buried underneath the logs and the sand that we couldn't begin to get them out. Here's a tire that's so deeply wedged in there that we couldn't get them out. So those are a few things, but we did actually get a lot of stuff out of there. And here we are. This is at the end of the expedition. We're wrapping up our last lifts, and you can see the barge there is completely filled with bags and bags of debris. You can probably just make out all the people on the back of the deck there. That gives you an idea of the size, the scale of the operation. On this particular barge, or that barge probably has somewhere in the order of 350 to 400 bags of those white cubic meter bags. A neat drone shot that Jeff did with looking down onto the barge. The amount of debris that we collected in that time is still staggering for me. And another view of the debris on the barge. And there was a pretty happy crew on the Cascadia as we finally finished and did the last lift. And we started to make our way back home. Got to see some wildlife as we were going back home. Pacific white-sided dolphins cruising by the ship. And I don't know if anybody recognizes that mountain, but we finally made it back towards Victoria after 6.5 weeks. And there's Mount Baker. And I think what I've got here is a short little video clip that Jeff put together that gives you an idea of the whole kind of process in a summary. And I'm hoping that this will work, okay? Okay, this is that time lapse, and I've slowed it down a little bit because this really shows what it was like to clean a beach. One of the things that we discovered was if we could see one piece of debris on the beach when we landed, we knew we probably had at least a bag's worth that was all hiding amongst the rocks. There we go. And of course, that's our requisite sunset to end the presentation. And I'm happy to answer any questions people may have. And see if I can stop. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Michael. There are some questions on the chat.
Yep, I just found the chat again. So I see, is there any hope for source reduction? Well, the report that went to the government in mid-December basically addressed a bunch of these things, because really, as we gathered the debris, we got a sense of what was there. And one of the things is that, in Canada, we can try to do source reduction, but trying to track down where a lot of this stuff came from is really tricky. And so yes, there is hope, but it's going to be a long haul. And then I see, would these foreign bottles be property of the various crew members of fishing boats and not necessarily from the gyres? I think that they probably were thrown off ships that were most likely from the fishing. But again, it's really hard to tell where an individual bottle came from. Did we ever run into wildlife? And if so, was there any detangling of animals? So we didn't have to do any detangling of animals on our trip. I know that earlier this summer, there was whale entanglement that happened off Vancouver Island. So we didn't have to deal with that. We did get to see quite a few whales, a few wolves. I guess some people saw some bears, and yeah. What happened to all the debris? So on this first expedition, I should mention that the Tour Operators Association spent months and months trying to get funding to make this happen. And eventually we found out that the funding had come through literally, I think, 4 days or 5 days before the ship was leaving. And so we didn't really have enough time to kind of fully plan out the whole process and how to deal with all the debris. So what we were able to do was a good first start, but we, that was the word I'm looking for. The material was basically taken to Port Hardy and was taken to the landfill. And the question also said, will we be able to do this again? There is a hope that we will do this again next spring. And hopefully that will give us both better weather and the chance to learn from the experience of this previous expedition. And there's a lot of discussion already about how we can do a much better job of sorting and reusing and recycling, hopefully, some of the material. Do I have a crew roster? I don't have it. I don't specifically have one, but I know that there is one out there somewhere. How much is all the wood debris changing the environment? Well, there's no question that there is a huge amount of wood debris out there, and it's not the way the coast was. So I would say that it has made a dramatic effect on the coastline, and changes the nature of life on the shore. So that wood has changed the coastline tremendously. How much more is there out there to collect? Well, I would say that our expedition probably covered about a third maybe of the outer coast areas. So for a first clean, which is obviously the biggest clean, there's probably at least 2 or 3 expeditions left to do. But once that's happened, there's going to be ongoing kind of annual arrival of new stuff and moving stuff from one place to another. But there's still a lot out there, and it felt very good to leave some of the places that we left as clean as we did. But we also know that there's a lot of places that we didn't get to. Mike said, okay, Mike says, research on the wood in the ocean shows that there used to be more wood in the ocean before logging. Okay, I wasn't aware of that. Is this some information available? The report has gone to the government, and so I don't know when that's going to be made available through the government website, but I believe Phil is recording this presentation, so it's going to be available on the Natural History Society YouTube channel. And as a member of a local kayaking club, we're going to try and do annual cleanups of some of our local areas. I know that Chatham and Discovery Islands are still have a lot of debris that needs to be cleaned up. I think, what else have I got there? Oh, Sarah, are there ways to get involved with the expedition? These particular expeditions were organized around the crew who had not been able to work that season. So I think that basically that was the plan around the small ship tour operators were trying to create work for their out of work crew. So getting onto these expeditions would basically be involved in getting part of the crew. What else am I looking at here? Okay, I think, have I answered all the questions there, Phil?
I believe so. There's several just saying thank you, thank you.
Yeah, it was just an amazing and at times very depressing just to see how much stuff there was out there, and the sheer quantities of debris when you look at how much.
There is one question that came to me directly.
Yep.
Is all this information available somewhere to review?
Well, that's what I said. The report, which I just received from the main author today, has gone to the government, and I'm pretty sure that they will be releasing it in the near future. And as I say, the presentation that I gave, I believe you're going to be posting that on the YouTube channel. So
great.
Well, I've got a question about kayak campsites. No, there were very few kayak campsites along that coast. However, I suspect that actually there's one kayak campsite that we didn't get to because we just didn't get that far north. But we did find some kayaking campsites, but there were very few. It's not a very kayak friendly area.
No. I've done a kayaking out to, we tried to go to the Gordon Islands, but didn't quite make it that far.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Good. Well, are there any more questions, either on the chat or just directly? If not, I will thank Michael very much for his time tonight, and also for all his crew as well, or the crew he was working with on cleaning up that.
Yeah, well, I think on the call tonight we've got Jeff Reynolds was there. Bryden Smith was our captain. You saw a couple of pictures of him on deck with the foam. And who else did I see here? I'm sure there's probably some other people. I'm scrolling through the attendees here, but I think. Yeah, so anyway, we had I say there were about 100 crew between the 9 ships. So
yeah, great. Okay, the thank yous are pouring in on the chat, so much appreciated. And
thank you all for listening. And I say it was shocking to see how much stuff is still out there, and I really hope that we can get back out there again and get out there in a time when the conditions are even calmer, because towards the end of our expedition we couldn't get onto some of these shores that we knew had lots of stuff.
yeah, what time of year were you there? Summer?
Expeditions they were supposed to start in June, but they didn't begin until mid-August.
Oh,
The original proposal was to start in June, but the funding didn't come through till mid-August. So
right.
we basically went through mid-August till the end of September.
Yeah. What were the chances of ever recycling some of the plastic?
Well, I think that we're really looking at doing that for the next expedition, and we've been discussing how we could, have multiple layers of sorting of the material, both on the beach and on the barge, and kind of different ways of managing the material. As it was sort of really, I think we gathered the most stuff that we could in the time, but we didn't have a chance to recycle any of it, or very little of it. We did quite a few of those, what we call dragger ball floats. Quite a few of those went to the Heldsuck to help them with their row on kelp fishery, or their row on kelp harvesting.
There is another question here, or who in the government should we contact to encourage them to fund more of these cleanups?
Gosh, I don't know.
I guess it'd be federal, would it?
This was,
Although I guess
I don't exactly know where. I mean, government funding is often a bit complicated, and the grant actually came from the provincial government, but I believe that there were federal funds contributed into that. So
I think the shoreline is a BC responsibility, but the water is federal.
Yeah. So if it's floating, it's federal. If it's on land, it's provincial. Yeah. But I'm pretty sure that the provincial MLAs are the people to talk to or to ask. So.
This another comment. This would have been a big load to dump. Was it in Prince Rupert?
It was in Port Hardy.
Yeah.
And I think, so we've already figured out that there's ways that we can dramatically reduce the volume of the debris through crushing once we get.
All right.
So this last time, it basically, I think, went straight to the landfill, but if we do it again, we will have a kind of a staging point in Port Hardy where material can be broken down and compacted, and then recyclable material will be taken to recycling organizations.
So you might need an even bigger crew, to do all
yeah, I honestly don't know too much of the details of what the next proposal is. I know it's going to be going in the next little while, but so.
Right. I also have a message, I guess, to me about when the recording is available. You just have to keep checking. Usually we have to download it, and then the person who's doing the YouTube
Process itself, yeah.
has to upload it. So it depends how busy he is, since we're all volunteers. So
Yep.
it could be within the week. Okay.
Well, thank you everybody for listening and for all those great questions. And it was a it felt a very worthwhile endeavor to be part of.
I bet, yeah. Thanks again, Mike. This is from Don Scott. Another great presentation. Call the MP and MLA to get this going again this summer.
Mhm.
With COVID-19 still going strong, the small tour operator staff will still need employment. So this is a great and beneficial way to keep those folks employed.
Yeah,
Okay.
Thank you, Michael.
thank you.
Okay, I think I'll sign off now, and thank you again, Michael, for a great presentation. And we'll
Big thank you to all my fellow crew for, everybody played a huge part in making this whole thing work. It was a lot of teamwork,
Yeah.
gathering everything from feeding us to getting us from A to B and all the rest of it. So it was a big process. So
All right. Okay, well, I'll end the meeting now, and
okay.
thank you very much, everyone, for attending.
All right. Well, thanks, Phil. Okay.
Okay.